Not this week, but next week we're going to start adding windows and other building components in. And I wanted to start introducing you to some of these issues right now, in case some of you are ahead, but also because next week I'm going to really talk seriously, or in depth, should I say, about BIM modeling. And I'll only have a shorter period of time to discuss some of the other building components. So in M3, we're actually going to be adding glazing systems, a back wall. We're going to learn some new terms. What's parapet, this condition where the roof is, or the wall is sticking up above the roof, and a spandrel, the panel that goes between two floor levels. And we'll focus on those in detail in the next lecture next week. But I wanted to focus today on this kind of idea of the windows and their placement. I put this in. This was one of the students from I think last year or the year before. Just that I thought it was an interesting background that was added through just using a different rendering technique. Also, I want you to think about the narrative that you write. I'm really not sticking you to answering specific questions. That I got a lot of very similar answers to the questions I proposed in M1. And you can do that again. You can answer those questions the same way, but you can really put in anything about what your experience was, what you thought you learned, whatever you want to put in there. I'm really looking for some insight on what your project experience is. So please feel free to be more free about what you put in it. I've not gotten this happening yet, um, but let's see if I can make this part of the lecture right away and make sure it doesn't happen. This will give me a great deal of consternation if I get text coming from you where there's a white background and there's a dark area behind it, which means that you didn't set the text fill to transparent. Um, I will flag it and I'll give you a problem with grading until you correct it. I'm not going to downgrade you, but I won't complete your grade until we don't have things that look like they're ransom notes. Once again, that's the idea of pride in your presentations. And sometimes you'll come to the situation where if you make it just transparent and it's black text, it may not be very legible. So what I expect you to do is to change the color of that text so it fits the situation on which you're presenting it. So just a reminder, you'll use this all the way through school, and it's good to figure it out right now. So we're putting in, once we get our framing done, we get our columns put in place, we're going to insert these storefront glazing systems. And I want to explain a little bit about what they are technically, and we'll do that in a few minutes. But I also want you to be sensitive to this idea about placement of them, where they sit within the sill that we're creating for them, or the frame that we're creating around them. And the idea here is that if we make this flush, it will look different than if we set it back. The idea of creating a sense of texture, of depth to our architecture. And in this case, here they've set the window system way back in order to indicate another level of hierarchy to the system. You can see it gave an opportunity to insert some lighting systems. But even at the basic level of just creating a reveal, this idea of seeing this edge here, these are two materials meeting each other, and this little bit of offset creates a little bit of shadow detail and what would be called some visual interest to the architecture. It makes it easier to read this idea that the wall may be an actually much masser object, thicker object than the curtain wall, the glass framing that we're putting in its place. And here's some examples of similar things that we're going to do, but this idea of the spandrel. So here we have a glazing system coming up, and then in this case, it's probably, you can see a floor deck coming over. This would be where that floor would intersect. And in this case, they're keeping that open, somewhat similar to what we're going to do. And this idea of this space between these two is typically called a spandrel unit. And here, once again, a nice articulation of that placement of the glass. And so you can see our, and I'm sorry, this is a little bit bitmap looking, but you'll see when you draw this, this is very crisp and sharp. And a similar treatment going on over here where the glasses sit back from the front facade of the building, the front face edge of the building. And it creates a sense of richness, texture to the facade. So the elements that we're going to place are called storefront glazing, and this is typically how they are built up. I wanted to show you this kind of to help you understand this idea, especially when we place the glass, to look at it in plan view and see where the glazing typically is with respect to the inside and outside. So right now we're looking at the outside of the glass units. This is the part that you would see from the street. You'll notice that the glass units are typically closer to the street facade. They're set in the sill towards the street, leaving the white area usually deeper. In this case, this is another version of that window. It's still closer to the street side, just to leave less exposed area for rain to collect. Um, and it's a typical way that these windows are constructed. So they're set into these aluminum, what are called aluminum extrusions. They're very complex in their shape. They allow you to snap them together. They all have fits to each other. In this case, there are pieces of rubber separating certain elements. That's intended to be called what is called a thermal break. That means that this cold aluminum then is interrupted by a plastic or polymer that doesn't allow heat to transfer in. That's really way more than you need to know for computer viz, but I don't like the idea all the time of asking you to put components in that you really have no idea exactly what they look like. So I wanted to give you a brief introduction to it. And then typical modern glazing systems have typically two panels of glass separated by a gas between them to create a more insulating structure. And so here's just another detail. The reason why these details are important is because this is going to have to be added in section drawings. You'll notice that when we cut through storefront glazings that we're currently using, we don't get the rich detail that would happen in this kind of a drawing. So it'd be very typical for us to have to come in and add the sections to these pieces if we were trying to describe that. Sometimes that's not even required in our technical documentation. I think aluminum extrusions are so important to architecture. This idea of these shapes being pulled out in three-dimensional space that become structural elements or decorative elements, that it probably is a good time to maybe just show you how these things are actually made because it's kind of fun. I'm not sure another instructor will get a chance to introduce this concept to you. So I'm going to go ahead and play this video. This is the factory that would be making the frames, the glazing frames. And so we're starting with a billet of aluminum, and we're going to put it through a heating process and then extrude it out to a shape. And here we're seeing it's talking about a curtain wall, which is typical to what these aluminum extrusions are doing because they can't bear weight. So we're placing that into the oven. Once it's been heated up to temperature, it's rolled over into the extruder. That'll be pressed up into this ram as it's coming up right now. And now it's going to push it through a die, just like the Play-Doh machines would push Play-Doh through a die. And now it's going to come that complex shape that I just described. They come and lay out, and they're typically not straight from the extrusion process, and they're pulled together. They're pulled until they do become straight. And then they start to be cut to length, a workable length, so that they can be painted or what's called anodized. So that's those frames going into a painting system, or in the other way, into tanks that dip them into chemicals to put a oxidized coating on the exterior of the aluminum. So that's where we get the bronze tints, the colored tints to our aluminums. You can see the complex shape here that had been extruded out. And then in really advanced factories, they have automated cutting machines that will cut the profiles, the miters, all the things that are required to create the joinery for the system. And there's a whole nice series about that, but that won't be a topic for today. Let me get us back to our presentation. So here are those sections now. Um, this is part of our craft. We will do some section details, but we won't do these kind of details. This would be saved for construction tech. But we're going to be cutting through our building, and some of this stuff will be exposed. So I wanted you to become kind of comfortable in seeing this kind of a detail. This is, now we've looked at those extrusions, so I think when you see these, you can understand that those are the metal extrusions. We cut it in section. We can see that metal extrusion. We can see the two pieces of glass being held here. This is a spandrel area because it is at a floor system. So there's a clip coming out to attach the curtain wall to. So it's not unlike what we're going to be making in our drawing, and we'll actually do a little bit of this similar detail. Once again, just so you can visualize it, I think after looking at the drawings and back to this again, two pieces of glass, this idea that this is the finish cap, so this is the outside. The depth of the system is typically towards the interior of the building. In this case, by varying this depth, you can change the strength of the building to, or the wall to resist loads on it, wind loads or whatever might be implied upon it. Glass is going to be a really important subject for you to deal with as architects. The idea of there are so many variations in the way that you can apply glazing systems to the exterior and nuances to it that can radically affect the appearance of your architecture. For instance, what happens at the corners, whether it looks like it's a continuous piece of glass or whether there's a piece of aluminum interrupting that. In this case, the idea was to make these panels of glass as dominant on the feature as possible. So the glazed area, the place where the panels meet, is minimized to the point where there's actually not even a clip here any longer. There's just a silicone bead. And same thing at this corner. And you'll notice at this corner they held the glass all the way to the edge. And even though you can see in here to see this internal structure, the reflections on the glass will give the illusion when you're looking at it from the exterior that this is in fact two glass panes meeting completely together. And this will very much recede away from what you'll see at the street level. And so this is kind of an example of that idea of getting rid of all of that front metal work that we actually put in our framing system. And actually you can see a little bit of a comparison here. If you look over to the right on here, you'll notice here's a building where, excuse me just a second, let me get my pointer going here again. You can see here's vertical mullions, and they're very dominant. You see the vertical elements between the glazing units. Here, the architect has been very careful about making sure that none of the metal appears. So these are actually just a minimized amount of spacing between the panels, and they have a continuously uniform flat surface. And the net effect is, if you'll notice the reflection, it's a very continuous reflection. There's no shadows created by because there are no components sticking out on the face of the glass. So these are obviously nuances that I hope you'll give consideration to while you're modeling, and how your appearances may not line up with what you've actually seen constructed. One of the last components that we're going to do in M2 is to construct the back wall. Excuse me, yes, it's M2 of CMUs, concrete masonry units. And so I wanted to show you kind of the details about those, just some visualization. So these are typically 8-inch deep blocks. They're in a staggered arrangement. These are some details of the attachments of them when they're in an engaged I-beam situation. In our case, we put the I-beam on the inside of the wall, so it's a little bit different. So here's an example of that same start of that wall construction with the CMUs. We put a whole back wall up like that. We don't make a point out of showing how these are connected to the steel, but they would need to be in order to support it. So here's that typical wall now constructed vertically. And you'll notice that they have supports on both sides of it because it hasn't been structurally stabilized by what would be the attachment of the steel and the floor decks yet. So this is under construction. Here's kind of what happens down at the grade level at details. So we'll be pouring a floor. We're not going to specify this kind of level of a notch in order to um, include the concrete block wall. But typically they have rebar going through them, reinforcement bar, that ties them together to give them vertical strength that way. And they have sometimes a mesh that goes between the mortar line in order to create strength in the transverse direction. And here's another example of a detail with a wall constructed on it. I'm showing you these because they're references that I can grab off the internet. I would invite you to, and they really contribute to a much better understanding of what happens at the detail level of the things that you start to build, and kind of the need for what elements are missing. For instance, as green is a flashing detail, that any water that would get between the two would be directed to the outside of the building. And here's probably closer to the kind of detail that we're actually building. So here we have an interior floor slab that we're pouring at the same level as the top of our foundation, but we would need to include this rebar prior in that wall in order that the masons, when they come to lay in this block, will have a way to tie this wall to it. So this would show up in a section detail. So that concludes just kind of a brief introduction, really brief, but also really more in detail about the components you're putting in. I really wanted you to have a flavor for the parts and pieces before you just started using them as the tools in your software.